Flower Fairies, just a beginning. Once upon a time, in the long, long ago, this world was just a baby world, and everything on it was very different from the way it is now. Oh, very different. All the flowers in all the forest were snow white. In that long ago time, when the world was a baby world, for babies always have white things around them. So all the flowers were white, and the clouds were white, and the soft white snow covered the ground all winter through, so the dead brown leaves could hide. In those days, the world seemed very small and babyish instead of big and covered with oceans and mountains and forest. Of course, it wasn't really truly little, for the world didn't grow any bigger as people did. No, but the things on them changed, something like the lines on people's faces. But you see, in the long ago time, there were no airships in which people could fly up and see how big the world was. And there were no trains to take the people a long distance, and there were no boats to carry people across the ocean. The only way to get anywhere was to walk. Yes, did you know about Italy or China that way? Did you? It would not have done any good if there had been airships and trains and boats, for there were no people to ride in them. Nobody lived on the earth then, only fairies, and fairies don't ride on trains. And really, the fairies then cared very little for exploring the world and finding out how big it was and such things, for each band of fairies was so happy in its own forest and playing in its own brook that there was no time to hunt in other forests. You see, the world was different. Between work and play, so bright and early, they got up and did all the things that they had to do, and they did all the things they wanted to do, and they couldn't tell which was the most fun. And wasn't that a joke on the fairy? Each little fairy slept in a flower at night, so just before sunrise, the flower would unfold its petals ever so little to wake up the fairy. Then the fairy would open his eyes and stretch. Oh, it was such fun to stretch good and hard in the morning, and that would make the flowers open out wide so the fairies could jump down to the ground. Of course, all the brothers and sisters and cousins of the fairies got up just the same way and at the same time, and they all had very little or very jolly scrambled down the brook to take their baths. Oh, they thought it was a lots of fun to take a bath in the brook. After they had splashed around a while and got all freshened up, each fairy dipped the tip of its wing in the water and ran as fast as they could back to the flower where he had slept. There he shook his fingers over the flower so that the glittering Drops would wash the petals. Fairy washed the flowers every day. Even now, only grown folks don't know it. They sleep until after the fairies are in hiding for the day. Nowadays, fairies play only at night. That's the reason you never see them. And then when people get up and walk in their gardens and see the fresh drops of water on the flowers, they say, "Oh, see the dew?" And they never even think about the fairies. By the time the fairies were so hungry, they couldn't think of anything but breakfast. So they folded their arms, stood on tiptoe, and fluttered their wings, and up they flew to the nearest flower for breakfast. All night long, the flowers had been working so that in the morning a golden drop of honey lay in the heart of each blossom, all ready for some little fairy to come and eat it. That an easy way to get breakfast, I am sure. After all, the little fairies went to school and the big fairies tended their work, so they could surely be through the afternoon and all play together before sundown. At the close of the day, when the sun had gone to rest for the night and the stars had lit their candles so the fairies could see to go to bed, each fairy snuggled down in his own little flower bed and dreamed of wonderful things he would do the next day. And that was a day in the long ago. Fairy names too. There were so many fairies in the forest, and they were all so much alike that it was hard work even for them to tell one from the other. So the fairy queen said, I'm going to give each one of you a number, and then when I call, you can tell whom I want. The bigger fairies helped her, and they called all through the forest. When the sun is high in the sky, come to the queen's green palace to be numbered. The queen, of course, had many palaces, as all queens do. There was a pink one in the east of the forest where the sun rose, and a crystal palace where the brook jumped down over the rocks, and the green palace in the heart of the forest. To enter it, the queen went to the greenest, quietest part of the forest, and there was a mossy cave, all covered with branches of trees and shrubs covered with white blossoms and green leaves. Right in the center, in front of the door of the cave, was a green, mossy throne where the queen could sit, and just a little farther out was a tall, pale green flower. We call it Jack in the Pulpit now, and in it the queen could sit when she wished to be high above the other fairies or to see long distances. At one side of the palace was a tiny little brook. The water in it ran very quietly and gently, making dainty little pools that the queen used for mirrors. She liked very much to sit in her high flower throne and let the wind wave her over the water so she could see herself and the leafy green overhead reflection in the clear water. Sometimes she would reach out her hand and the tiny fishes would wave their fins and flash a signal of greetings to her. The birds would come to drink at the pool and stay in the tall stalks and talk with the queen, and even the water spiders would weave designs for her on the surface of the pond. Of course, she liked her green palace. When it was nearly noon on the day the fairies were to be numbered, the queen went to the dressing room of the green palace to array herself in her most queenly robes. Oh, yes, she put on a soft white skirt made from the thinnest flower petals, then white silk stockings and slippers carved from a pearl shell. Her dress, which was made of white satiny water lily petals, was put on her by her maids of honor. When all else was ready, they called the gray spider, who were dressmakers to the queen, and they went up and down all over her dress until it covered every bit with silvery cobwebs of lace. The queen was beautiful to look at, and all the fairy maids who helped dress her were very proud of her, for she was kind and wise as well as beautiful. When all was ready, the queen put on her head her golden crown with the star on it, and then walked out and climbed up into her flower throne. Just then the sun was high in the heavens, and all the fairies came trooping up to be numbered. The queen was very happy to see so many of her subjects all at once, and she nodded and smiled at each and every one as she gave them the number. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and on and on. About the time she got to 77, 78, 79, she got pretty hoarse, but she was determined, a determined little queen, and very anxious to number all of her subjects in one day. So she kept bravely on. 129, 130, 131, and so forth. When she reached 167, 168, and 169, she was so sleepy, and she had forgotten all of. She was so sleepy she could hardly keep her eyes opened, and she had forgotten all about her lace dress and golden crown and pearl slippers. All she could think about was keeping her eyes open and saying the numbers straight. 129, 131. Oh wait, I already did that. 374. Her voice grew softer. 348. 349. Her voice trailed off to nothing. The fairy queen was fast asleep. Now, of course, when the queen goes to sleep, everybody has to wait quietly until she wakes, unless the queen has ordered them to call her. So all the fairy people sat down where they were and whispered quietly together and waited. But she slept quietly a little while until the sun began to drop in the sky, and everybody was wondering how in the world she was going to get through all the rest of the numbering that day when she awoke. She sat upright on her throne and looking around said, Why, all of you are sitting around there looking at me. Everybody was a little frightened, for they didn't wish to displease her. Finally, the little girl fairy right under the throne plucked up the courage to say, If you please, oh queen, you told us to come and be numbered, so we're waiting for you to begin. Then the queen remembered all about it, and she had sent for them to be numbered, and then she had numbered as far as 349 and gone to sleep. She looked around at the host of fairies yet to be numbered, and she looked at the sun fast sinking in the sky and exclaimed, I think numbering fairies is a very stupid business. All the fairies nodded their head and waited, for they had no idea what she would do next. I don't want to you numbered anyway. Think how it would be for me to say, 967, come carry my train. Then she noticed for the first time that every fairy was dressed in his or her best clothes in honor of the day, and every single fairy had struck in the front of his or her hair a favorite flower or leaf or twig. A happy thought occurred to her. She waved her magic wand over the host of fairies and cried, All the flowers and twigs and leaves that you wear in your hair shall stay fresh forever, and your name shall be the name of that which is in your brow. And to this day, every fairy wears something, a spotted leaf, a green twig, a white violet, or a yellow stem in front of the hair. And when you wish to call a fairy by name, you look at his forehead and call him spotted leaf or green twig or whatever you see on his brow. And so the fairies were named. Oh, the next chapter, Sunshine and Flowers. White Violet was a dainty little fairy maid with golden hair and flimsy wings. Her dresses were always of the finest of white satin, and she wore a tiny gold chain around her hair, and a pure white violet hung from the chain right above her brow. She played and romped and had a beautiful time all day and never bothered about her clothes at all. For if they showed the least sign of getting mussed and soiled, she would stop her work and play and say, Must us clean us? Quick as a flash, they would all be clean again, pressed as nice as you please. That is surely an easy way to get freshly dressed, isn't it? One morning, White Violet finished all the work she had to do and started off with Green Twig and Silver Grass to play in the forest. Their favorite place was where the tiny spring bubbled out of the side of the hill and ran, trickling down over the white pebbles to join the brook and valley. When the bright drops dripped from the pebble to pebble, they made gorgeous rainbows on which the fairies played Jump the Rope. Then they tired of that and they played London Bridge on rainbows. One side would stand on one bow, and the leader would reach across to the leader on the next rainbow, and then the side that broke down would tumble helter-skelter into the water. And such shouting and splashing as there was, and when they all stood laughing and dripping on the dry bank, they shook themselves and shouted, "Muck us, clean us!" And in a twinkle, everybody was clean and tidy and fresh as could be, and off they scrambled for some more fun. "Let's play giant in the cave," said Green Twig, for all boys, even fairy boys, love to play pirates and giants and such games. They went around to the other side of the hill where there was a beautiful mossy cave and spent the rest of the morning playing giant. About afternoon, White Violet was lying at one side of the cave with a great green twig. Giant had thrown her when she looked towards the door and noticed ever so many sunbeams dancing in the air. "Oh," she cried, and jumping to her feet, "let's not play giant anymore. Let us catch sunbeams, and after we have a great many, we'll play a game with them." Green Twig thought that wouldn't be much fun, for he couldn't see any sunbeams, and anyway, he liked to be the giant. But Silvergrass was charmed with the idea. White Violet showed Green Twig some tiny sunbeams dancing in the air, and he at once became interested and agreed to catch as many as he could for the game. "But how shall we carry the sunbeams after we've caught them?" asked Silvergrass. "Oh, just in your hands, I guess," said White Violet, who really hadn't thought anything about it except that it would be fun to catch them. "That won't do for me," shouted Green Twig. "I have a handful already." And sure enough, while the others were barely getting started, he had caught a whole handful of dancing sunbeams and was vainly trying to stuff them into his pockets. "I know a better scheme than that," said White Violet. Let's play. Let's find some spiders and have them weave bags for the sunbeams." "Just the thing," shouted Green Twig and Silvergrass together, and off they scampered to where 3 fat green and black spiders were busily spinning silver nets from branch to branch on the bushes. "If you please," said White Violet to the fattest and jolliest of the 3, "will you spin us a bag to put our sunbeams in?" "Of course we shall be glad to," said the spider, and he and his brothers went to work. In a twinkle, 3 dainty bags were ready, and White Violet and Green Twig and Silvergrass thanked the spiders, slung the bags on their shoulders, and started off to catch the sunbeams. All afternoon they ran and flew over the meadows and through the woods to catch the golden beams and putting them in their cobweb bags. Other fairies, seeing them having such a jolly time, called out, "What are you doing? What are you putting in your bags?" And the 3 fairies replied, "We're catching sunbeams. Don't you want to get some?" The other fairies always said they did. So before long, all the fairies were chasing sunbeams. Nobody noticed that the big old sun was getting lower and lower, and that the birds were going to their nests until all of a sudden it seemed the sun was gone and there were no more sunbeams to catch. Then everybody sat down and drew a long breath and wondered what they would do with the sunbeams now that they had them. "I'll tell you what to do," said White Violet. "We are all too tired to play with our sunbeams tonight, so let's put them in our flower beds and go to sleep. And then in the morning we'll be ready to play with them the very first thing." Everybody thought it was a fine idea. So all the fairies who had started late gathered only a few sunbeams, sprinkled them in the center of the flower, and climbed in, pulled up the petals, and went to sleep. Those who had started early and had a bag full of sunbeams dumped their bright gold in the center of their flower, then climbed in, pulled the petals shut. Those who had started early in the evening had a bag full of sunbeams, dumped their bright gold in the center of the flowers and all over the sides too. And every fairy went to sleep and then slept so soundly they never knew that in the middle of the night the Queen Fairy waved her wand in a dream and changed all the sunbeams to gold and melted the gold into the flowers. The fairies never guessed when she did it. But in the morning, when they woke up, there in the very center of every flower was a spot of gold, and on the flower that were eventually full of sunbeams the night before were turned all the way to gold. And ever since then there have been some golden flowers, buttercups, golden glows, marigolds, but in the heart of every flower of white there is a spot of gold where the sunbeam lay. Pansies for thought. One morning, the Queen Fairy awakened with a feeling that she was going to think of something very nice, but she couldn't quite tell what it was. All the time she was taking her bath and watering her flower bed and tidying her palace, she tried to remember the very nice thing, what the very nice thing was, but she couldn't remember. Oh no. Then, just as she was going to climb into her flower throne, she suddenly knew. "Why, of course," she exclaimed, "I'm going to have a party. I dreamed all about it." So she climbed up high on her flower throne and called her messenger to her. "Go quickly," she commanded, "and tell all the fairies in the kingdom that I will have a party this afternoon, and they must all come." So the messenger flew quickly over the kingdom and told all the fairies that they were invited to the Fairy Queen's party that very afternoon. Then, indeed, they were all hurrying and scurrying in the forest, for the Queen's parties were rare treats. Every single fairy wished to look his very best. The spiders were busy weaving lace frocks, and along the side of the brook were rows and rows of fairies combing their hair, arranging their jewels where they looked in the watery mirrors. About noon, everybody was ready to go when Leafbud said to Smooth Pebble, "Don't you think we ought to take the Queen a present? Maybe it's her birthday." Yes, said Smooth Pebble thoughtfully. I think that's a very nice idea. But what should we take? The queen already has everything. I know, said Leafbud. We can take a fresh flower. Nobody has enough of those. Just the thing, said Smooth Pebble brightly. Let's tell everybody we see to take her a pansy. So they did. Everybody was so happy to take a present to the queen that when they all had laid their flowers before her, the ground was nearly covered with snow white pansies. There were no colored ones then, you know. The queen was very happy to think her subjects had been so thoughtful to bring her a lovely gift. She was anxious to keep the flowers fresh and new, so she asked all the fairies to stand their pansies in the brook at the edge until the party was over, and they did, and the brook looked very weird and very pretty with its border of white pansies along each bank. After the flowers were fixed, the fairies played many kinds of games for an hour. By the time they were tired enough to sit down on the smooth grass and eat the dinner the queen had prepared for them, there was honey and dew in tiny cups, and every good thing the fairies enjoyed. But they couldn't understand what the weird silver pile of threads in the center of the circle was for. And when all had finished eating, the queen said, "This center pile is a pile of cobwebbed thread. The beginnings are here and the ends are somewhere in the forest. Go and search for the end, for there you'll find a gift from me." With happy shouts, each fairy picked up a cobweb and started off to find his gift. They had to go very carefully, for cobwebs are easily broken, and these crossed and recrossed each other many, many times. White Violet and Red Bud and Leaf Bud found theirs ran close together, so they helped each other over the hard places, and at the end they found their gift on either side of a smooth rock. What do you suppose the gifts were? Magic paint boxes. Think of that. White Violet knew at once what hers was for, and she started to paint some pictures on the rock. She painted clouds and trees and birds and was so happy that she forgot all about being polite until Leafbud reminded her. Together they picked up their boxes and started back to thank the queen. There they found dozens of happy fairies laughing and shouting and thanking the queen for her gifts. "Dear friends," said the queen, holding up her hand for them to quiet down, "I am so glad you like the paint boxes. Now, I will tell you how to use them. They are magic paints, and anything you paint with them will stay colored that way forever. So be very careful how you will use them. Now, for a beginning, I want each of you to paint for me the white pansy you brought me today." "How shall we paint it? What colors do you like best?" "I like all the colors," answered the queen. "You must look at what you like best and paint the color that makes you think." So all the fairies set to work, and everything was very quiet except for the swish of their brushes and the sound of mixing paint. White Violet looked up at the clear blue sky and painted her daisy deep blue with flecks of white. Leaf Bud looked at the golden sun and painted hers yellow with streaks of black for the branches of the trees she saw against the sky. Green Twig thought the dark corners of the forest and painted deep purple like the dusky shadows. Spotted Leaf thought of the twilight and painted the rose of the clouds, the blue of the sky, and the purple of the coming night, all on the face of one flower. But poor little Silver Moth thought and thought so hard what color he should paint his that he fell off the rock and was sitting on. He fell off the rock he was sitting on and tumbled into the brook and spilled all of his paint. So one little pansy stayed pure white. When the flowers were finished, the queen was delighted with them. I think these are much prettier than the all-white ones, she said gravely. But when I look at these pansies, I can guess what you were thinking about. So she waved her wand and ordered that all the pansies ever after should be colored like those. And when the party was over, so always the pansies were colored for the sky and the trees and the shadows and the sunshine, and every pansy stands for a loving thought. Fire. Over in the far corner of the forest was a rocky hollow where once a brook had been. All around the hollow stood tall sycamore trees with their white branches spread out towards the sky. At one time, the fairy school was held in the sycamore tree because the white shrunken branches were so good for the fairies to learn to write on. But the brook below tempted them to stay down and play instead of climbing up to school. So the fairy queen dried up the brook and changed the school to another part of the forest. But this morning, thank you, Barry, this morning was vacation, and the sun shone, and the leaves of the early frost had brought the ground gleaming goldy brown to the sunlight. Spotted Leaf, Green Twig, Gray Moss came frolicking along the path, chasing each other and playing leaf tag until they saw the hollow where the brook had been and noticed many smooth, round stones over which the brook had once flowed. "Let's play duck on the rock," cried Gray Moss happily. "All right," shouted Spotted Leaf. "I'll get the duck." And he scampered among the stones, searching until he found the very smoothest and roundest stone of all. This he carefully placed on top of the large, smooth rock in plain sight where all could hit it. Then each fairy picked up a handful of stones and started to throw. You see, the small round stone was the duck on the rock, and the fun of the game was to hit the duck and make it fall off the rock. They threw and shouted and laughed at each other's failures and had such a merry time. They didn't notice that some of their friends had come up and began to throw too, Finally, there were 9 fairies, all throwing and shouting and laughing at one another, and how the sparks did fly. Faster and faster came the rocks until all at once 3 rocks hit the stone dock all at once, and off it flew into a pile of dead brown sycamore leaves, the stiff, crackly kind, you know. No, that isn't the end of the story. You know, if rocks hit each other hard enough, sparks of real fire come. And when these 3 rocks hit the little duck rock, a trail of sparks splintered off into the dead brown leaves and set them on fire. And they all burned up. Now, Gray Moss, Spotted Leaf, and Green Twig had never seen any fire before, and they thought it was a new kind of flower the queen had suddenly made. So they ran up to pick some, but it burned their hands, and when they turned to run away, it burned their wings and frightened them. They had never been so frightened that way before. They couldn't understand it at all. So Green Twig made his hands into a trumpet and blew and whistled to all the older fairies to come and take care of him, but nobody heard and nobody answered. Then Spotted Leaf made his hands into a trumpet and blew and whistled, but nobody answered. And all the other fairies tried too, but their fingers were stiff. They had burned them, and they couldn't blow with them. So they sat around rather quietly, watching the fire. First the flame, higher and hotter and crackling like a giant eating its food. Then the little flames like tongues ran out clear to the edges of the dead leaves to lick every bit of the good from them. Then the fire danced a wild dance. It threw its arms in the air, clapped its hands, and it grew smaller and smaller until, with a flicker and a sigh, it went out, and the sparks in the ash twinkled and flashed like the fireflies at night, and then they were gone. The fairies, the fairies sat very still to see what wonderful thing happened next. They watched very closely, but nothing happened, and nothing happened. And then they all drew a big sigh and slowly got up and pinched themselves to see if it wasn't all dreams. No, they were awake. What strange thing had happened? Very cautiously, they crept up to the gray ashes, and then nothing hurt them. They grew bolder and kicked the ashes and searched carefully for more of its wonderful fire, but it was all gone, every bit. "Oh," cried Gray Moss, "let's hurry and tell Queen Fairy and our fathers all about it, and maybe they can get more of those weird, warm flowers." So they scampered towards home, half running, half flying. So eager were they to get there and tell their news. The queen saw them coming and sat out on the very edge of her flower, for she could see they had something interesting to tell her, but they were so eager to talk at once, and she could hardly understand them. So she raised her hand and said, "Gray Moss, you may speak first. Tell me, what did you see?" "Dear Queen, we were playing duck on the rock, and suddenly a beautiful flower, very wonderful and different from any we had ever seen, appeared in the midst of the dead brown sycamore. It grew and grew and waved its petals, but when we reached out, it stung our hands so they still hurt. Then we watched. It grew smaller and smaller until the red was all gone, only some pieces of gray stuff which crumbled to powder when we touched them. So we hurried back to ask you what this was and where we can find more of this curious flower. My children, said the queen, I understand it no more than you do, for I have never, with all my magic, seen or heard of such a flower. I cannot even see a picture in my mind. Oh, I know what we can do, said Green Twig, clapping his hand. We can paint a white flower to look like the new flower. Then the queen will know what it looked like. So, shouting and laughing for joy, they hurried off for their magic paint boxes. Green Twig was the first to get his ready, and strapping it on his back, he climbed up on a big white geranium and very carefully painted it a gorgeous red. Then he clambered down and looked up at it from the ground. No, he said, that's the color all right, but it isn't one bit like the new flower. I'll see what the others are doing. By this time, Gray Moth had found a white rose and was painting it red as fast as he could. That doesn't look a bit like the new flower, scoffed Green Twig. And anyway, roses smell sweet, and the new flower was bitter and burned. And he went to find what Spotted Leaf was doing. He was perched up on the top of a tall plant called a canna and painted the weird shaped white flower as fast as he could. Just as he was ready to come down, he spilled some yellow paint on one side of the flower he had painted, and he couldn't get it off. So he climbed down anyway to take a look at his handiwork. Green Twig and Gray Moss came up just then, and they were looking at the newly painted flower. A breeze came by and blew and shook the cannon till the blossom waved and waved its petals joyously. Green Twig and Gray Moss came up. The three little fairy boys laughed and clapped their hands. That's like the new flower, just like the new flower. Call the queen to see it. The queen came quickly. And saw the curious red and yellow cannon shaking its gaudy petals in the breeze, and was so pleased with its curious beauty that she waved her hand over it and over the geranium and the rose so they would stay their new color forever. And ever since then, some of the geraniums are red to remind people of the strength of the flames, and some of the roses are crimson to make people remember the warmth of the fire. And always the cannons are red and yellow, like a real flame.
One morning in the early summer, a messenger from a nearby forest appeared before the queen fairy and delivered a message carefully wrapped in a silken cocoon. The queen was greatly pleased to receive a really, truly letter, for fairies seldom get letters. So she called all the fairies playing nearby and asked them to help her read it. They immediately stopped their games and gathered around the queen. She unwrapped and unwrapped until the folds of shimmering webs were spread out before her, and she could plainly read the letters painted on the silk. The note said, "Dear Flower Queen, I have many times heard from the birds and the bees tales of your beautiful house. Until I am very until I'm very anxious to see your forest for myself. If it is convenient for you to be at home, I will come and make you a call. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, please give my messenger your answer. Your friend, the Crystal Queen." A great clapping of hands greeted the reading of the message, and the Queen exclaimed, "Of course I'll be home." But she must write the answer, so she called 3 fat, sheepy-looking silkworms to her, and very soon they had woven a silky roll on which the Queen printed a note telling the Crystal Queen that she would be home and that the Crystal Queen would be most welcome. The messenger took the roll of silk, carefully wrapped it in a brown covering, and departed. When he was out of sight, all the fairies heaved a big sigh, looked at each other. A queen from another forest to visit them? Who had ever heard of such a wonderful thing happening? What could they do to make her visit pleasant and happy? Everybody was still thinking and thinking. "I have an idea," cried the Queen, clapping her hands. "Let's have a pageant for her." "A pageant!" exclaimed the white violet. "What is a pageant?" "A pageant," replied the Queen, "is a parade that tells a story, and it must all be very, very beautiful." "Well, but what story could we tell in a parade?" asked the green twig. I can't think of anything that would do." "Well," said the Queen, who had been thinking hard, "I think we could have a pageant of a day and represent the sunrise, the noon, and the night in our parade. Would you like that?" "Just fine!" shouted the fairies together. "Only you must tell us what to do." "You who are on the side," said the Queen, waving her right hand, "are the morning, and your costumes must show the color of the sunrise. You in front of me are noontime, and you must be the brilliant gold and white of the sun at noon. You over there, wave your left hand. You are the sunset, and you must show how the sun glows and slowly fades into night. Now, you must all get to work on your costumes at once, for there is much to do and only this day to do it." As she waved her hands for them to depart, she added, "Be here before 10 in the morning and bring with you a trumpet painted to match your costume." As soon as she finished speaking, the fairies hurried off to their homes to begin work. All the afternoon, they worked on gathering silky flower petals, taking them to the spiders to be woven together and paint on them the beautiful colors of the sky. Throughout the whole forest was heard the hum of preparations. At last night came, and the tired fairies were glad to stop and rest. Everything was ready except the trumpets, and those could be fixed in the morning. So, with tired fingers but light hearts, the fairies tumbled into their flower beds for the night, and all night long they dreamed wonderful dreams of pageants. Bright and early in the morning, every fairy hopped happily down to the ground, so happy they could hardly wait until 10 o'clock. White, Violet, Sparkling Shell, and Leaf Bud had been separated from in the crowd before the queen when she planned the parade, so each was a different part of the pageant. But they agreed to bring their costumes to White Violet's home to help each other dress. Leaf Bud was in the morning section, and her dress was a rosy pink with silver lace over it, so that when she moved, it looked like the morning sunshine. On her head, she wore a crown of diamonds, which sparkled like dewdrops on the flower. Sparkling Shell represented the noon. Her dress was made of white, satiny, water lily petals, and she wore a golden girdle and a golden band in her hair. White Violet was an evening fairy, her dress of pale violet blue, like the evening sky, had silver stars all over it, and her girdle was of rose color, like the sunset clouds. On her head she wore a tiny band of gold, to which was fastened a golden crescent. When they were all dressed, they ran to where the morning glories grew and picked their trumpets. But they had forgotten that the morning glories were all white, and the queen had said that the trumpets should match their costumes. So quickly they ran home, slipped on their aprons, and painted the morning glories gorgeous colors of rose and yellow and blue to match their dresses. By the time it was nearly 10 o'clock, and they put their paint boxes away and hurried off to the queen's palace. There they saw dozens of other fairies in beautiful costumes, all carrying happily painted morning glory trumpets. The queen had them hide behind some of the tall bushes so they wouldn't be seen until the pageant began. Promptly at 10 o'clock, a beautiful red bird flew down from the trees, and on his back rode the crystal queen. When the bird reached the ground, the queen daintily stepped down and greeted the flower queen. Flower Queen took her hands together, and together they flew up into the Jack on the pulpit throne. When they were comfortably seated, Flower Queen gave a signal and the pageant began. From behind the bushes, groups of fairies dressed in the sunrise colors marched out, all playing fairy music on their morning glory trumpets. After them came the noontime fairies in white and gold and waving dazzling golden banners in the sunshine. Following them came, turning the page, the sunset fairies, the most beautiful of all, in their colors of violet, blue, and rose. The crystal queen was so delighted with the parade that she stood up and clapped her hands all the time it was going by. When it was over, the Flower Queen invited all the fairies into her cave palace, which was the largest of her houses, to have lunch with the two queens. The fairies were delighted with the idea, and setting their trumpets down on the mossy bank, they trumped into the cave. There they had such a jolly time eating lunch and making speeches and playing games, and they never once thought of the flower trumpets in the sun. At 2 o'clock, when they came out of the cave, rested and ready for another march, what do you suppose they found? All the dainty morning glory trumpets which they had left standing, the broad ends down in the sun, had curled up and fainted and faded until they looked dirty white pipes standing on mussed up frills. And though each fairy picked up his trumpet and blew, trying to get it back in shape again, it was too late. The trumpets were spoiled. Ever since then, the morning glories open out in the fresh morning and happy, but by noon they curl up and fade because the fairies left them too long in the hot sun, and the colors of morning glory are the colors of the sky at morning, at noon, and at sunset, just as the fairies painted them for the pageant long ago. The magic perfume. The sun began to drop in the western sky, and still the crystal queen lingered. Even queens find it hard to go home when they're having a fine visit. At last she jumped up and exclaimed, "Now I must go, for the night will soon be here. But first I want to give you a magic gift. I will place it in the most beautiful flower in your forest." "The most beautiful flower!" exclaimed the Flower Queen. "How can I tell which is the most beautiful flower when they're all so lovely?" "You must decide," said the Crystal Queen, "for my gift can only go to one flower." "If that is the case," replied the Flower Queen, "come into my garden and we will see which is the most beautiful flower of all." Calling 2 or 3 fairies to go with them, they went into the very heart of the forest, where they found a lovely garden. In this garden was every kind of flower that grew in the forest, and it was so planned that each flower looked its very best. Can you imagine? As they entered the gate, the Crystal Queen exclaimed, "I don't wonder you couldn't decide, for I never even imagined so many lovely fairies grew in the world. What shall we do to decide?" "I have a plan," said the Flower Queen, who had been gravely thinking what to do. "You see, our flowers are not just pretty things to look at, but they have lives of their own. Sometimes their very beautiful flower is not all good, and sometimes one not so pretty at first sight is really lovely. Now my plan is to walk up and down through the garden and listen as the flowers talk and see which is both the prettiest and the best." "What a wonderful idea!" said the Crystal Queen. "I never knew flowers could talk." Only a few people can understand them, Flower Queen replied. But if you will listen carefully, perhaps you can hear what they say. They walked on until they came to a big, stately sunflower. He proudly shook his leaves, lifted his head, and said, "You have stopped at just the right place, for you can easily see I am the handsomest flower in the garden. So see how tall and grand I am, and how large and glorious my flowers are." And just then a voice from a hollyhock a little further on called out, "Oh, Queen, if you wish to see a very best flower, look at me. I am as tall as the sunflower, but my flowers are of dainty colors, and anyone can see I am the prettiest." As As he spoke, he opened up two new blooms and proudly waved his stalks in the breeze. "I don't like them very well," whispered the Crystal Queen. "Let's look at some of the littler ones. Maybe they're not so vain." So they walked on until they came to some beautiful tulips. "These are pretty and good," said the Queen as she touched the satiny petals with her fingers. But as she spoke, the tulip said, "I knew you would be coming here, for you can plainly see I am the most beautiful flower that grows." The Crystal Queen shook her head so sadly. "No," she whispered, "I cannot give my gift to the tulips." And so they walked through the whole garden, admiring the stately irises, the dainty daffodils, and the lovely roses. But every time they were about to decide, the flower would speak up and ask for the gift. At last they were standing quietly at the far corner of the garden, wondering what to do, when they heard a saucy little buttercup say, "The Queen hasn't seen you. Why don't you ask her to take a look at you?" Turning to look for the flower to whom the buttercup was speaking, they saw a dainty little violet nestled down in the green moss. "What do you think, Violet?" asked the Queen. "Should I give you the magic gift?" "Oh, no, no," replied Violet. "There are so many flowers more beautiful than I am. You must look at them. I am only a very little flower." The queens both smiled and looked very happy, for they knew that the very last flower they had seen was the flower that was kind and modest as well as beautiful. The Crystal Queen opened a white pearl box which she had carried, and on the face of the violet emptied the powder it contained, saying, "Always and forever." Then she waved her hand over the violet. Immediately the powder melted into the heart of the flower, and the deliciously sweet perfume filled the air. "Now I must go," said the Crystal Queen, and calling her red bird, she jumped on his back. "I want you to come and see me some day," she called, and started back home. "Hasn't this been a wonderful day?" exclaimed Leafbud. "It almost seems like a dream," added Sparkling Shell. "We know it isn't a dream, though," said the Queen, "for we have the perfume of the violet all around us, and ever since then the violet has had the sweetest perfume of all the Flower Fairies. Springtime. Oh dear, I am so tired of the snow, sighed little Sparkling Shell one day when the winter was more than half over. I wish I could think of something different to do. Tired of the snow? Exclaimed White Violet. I am never tired of the snow. It is so soft and clean and white. I love looking at it, playing in it. Come on, Sparkling Shell, let's go over and play with Silver Moss and Leaf Bud. See, they are making a castle with turrets and towers out of the snow and ice. First they patted the snow down and formed firm and hard for a good floor. Then they built the sides of tiny snowballs, rolled hard and laid together like bricks. Then they wished to make a window. They laid some twigs across the opening and then shook snow over them to hide the brown. Soon the castle was up and high enough for a roof, and Silver Moss and Leaf Bud scampered off for some cedar branches, while Sparkling Shell and White Violet took some pine cones and brushed the floor of the house. Turning the pages. Smooth and clean, and filled up all the chinks between the snowballs with fresh snow. And then they laid cedar boughs across the roof and threw all the snow they could up on top to hide the brown and green. There, that's good enough, said Silver Moss. Now I'm going to make a tower. So am I, shouted Leafbud. Don't anybody look. They all set to work, each hiding from the other, so his tower would be a surprise. So quietly so quietly they did work that the forest was very still, the only sounds being that of cracking of the ice and branches of trees and the soft thud of snow as it blew from the tree to the ground. Mine's done, shouted Leafbud, only you'll have to help me put it in. So they scampered over to where Leafbud was working, and there they saw a beautiful round tower with windows in all the sides and a piece of cedar stuck on top for a flagpole. They all worked hard together and dragged the tower over to the snow castle and put it up on the front corner. Then they ran back to the other towers, and in a few minutes a lovely tower stood on top of each corner. Then they ran back of each corner of the castle, and the fairies stood off to admire their work. Well, what should we do next? Asked White Violet. It seems to me that this is just pretty as we could possibly make it. We ought to call the queen and let her see our castle, and maybe she can tell us what to do next, said Sparkling Shell. Yes, maybe she knows of something else to do, they all shouted as they skipped off to the winter palace to find the queen. You should see the winter palace. There were no flowers for the fairies to sleep in, so in the fall there was the very first thing Jack Frost did when he came down from the North Pole was to make ice houses for them along the edge of the brook. Now the queen's house was on a little hill overlooking the brook, so she could watch all her subjects when they were playing on the ice. The queen was very happy to go see the castle. She thought it was surely the prettiest one she had ever seen, and she promised to ask Jack Frost to put some icicles on it so it would be even prettier in the morning. Now, said Sparkling Shell, what shall we do next, dear queen? I am so tired of winter and ice and snow. I want the flowers to come. Well, well, said the queen, I wonder what we can do about that. And she smiled with a little sparkle in her eye, as if she knew something very nice, only she wouldn't tell them quite yet. You may each go in different directions through the forest and tell as many fairies as you can find to come to my palace when the sun is in the middle of the heaven. Then, when you are all there, I will tell you something to do. Oh, goody! Shouted the fairies as they hurried off. We know it's going to be something we like. And with a hop and a skip, they disappeared to do the errand. In about an hour, sorry about that, in about an hour, the fairies began coming to the palace, all eager to know what the surprise had been the queen had in store for them. A minute later, she came out before them, and following just behind her were two of her helpers carrying mysterious brown bags stuffed full with something. Nobody had any idea what it could be. My dear people, said the queen, one of our fairies told me this morning that you are all tired of winter sports and ready for flowers of spring. Yes, indeed, cried all the fairies together. We want the flowers to come and the birds, the ice to melt so we can see the fish in the brook. We want spring. Very well, then, replied the queen. You must all help me bring the spring. But how can we help? Asked little Violet. Jack Frost has his help, and his helpers are so much bigger and stronger than we are. I'll tell you a secret, said the queen. Jack Frost and his men are very strong and powerful, but there is one thing they are really afraid of, and that is a flower. If they see a blooming flower coming up through the ground, they pack up their snow and ice and vanish to the North Pole. But how can a blooming flower come through the ice and snow? Asked Sparkling Shell. That is just what I'm going to tell you, replied the queen. I have in these brown bags some magic seeds, and you must each have one seed. Come up now and get them, and I will tell you how to plant them. So the fairies marched past the open bags, and each fairy reached in and took one seed and held it tightly, waiting for the queen to speak again. Now, these are magic seeds, and they must be planted differently from other seeds, or they will not grow. Each fairy must go around through the forest and do some kind or loving act that right there plant the seed. In the morning we will see what happens. The queen nodded and smiled at them and waved her wand for them to go. The fairies went away very quietly, for they were all thinking about what the queen had said and wondering what kind act they could find to do. I don't see what a little fairy can do in winter, said Leafbud doubtfully. I don't either, said Silver Moss, but I'm going to keep my eyes open and maybe I'll see something. When he had walked but a little way, he noticed a squirrel trying to carry some nuts, but he was in such a hurry he kept dropping some. Here, let me help you, said Silver Moss. Thank you, said the squirrel. I'm trying to take these to a friend of mine who is hungry, and I want to get them there so quickly. I'll take part of your load, said Silver Moss. So they divided up and got to the hungry squirrel very soon. Thank you, Silver Moss, said the squirrel. That was a very kind deed. And Silver Moss went away towards home, thinking very hard. If that was a very kind deed, as the squirrel said, then I must plant the seed. So he went where he had first met the squirrel and planted the seed deep in the snow. Sparkling Bud found a poor little gray spider who had worked so hard weaving the net that her fingers were numb and cold. She took him into her snow house to let him get good and warm. He was so grateful that she told him all about the magic seed, and he said helping her plant the seed in the snow in front of her house. White Violet found a little sparrow with a hurt foot, so she went and got a cedar twig and a soft brown moss and fixed a comfortable bed for him to lie on and covered him with soft and warm so he could get nicely rested. Then, when he was all snug and warm and asleep, she remembered her seed and planted it beside him. So all through the forest, each fairy found something he or she could do, and the seeds were planted all before sundown. Bright and early the next morning, the fairies hopped up and ran to see what had happened to the seeds that night. And what do you suppose they saw? At every place they planted a seed was a tiny crocus flower was lifting its head from the snow. The fairies were so happy. They ran to tell the queen, and she went all through the forest with them, hunting for the flowers and watching the dainty petals unfold. By noon, there were dozens of happy crocuses. Some were white, some pink, some lavender, standing bravely in the snow. And just as the Fairy Queen said, Jack Frost and his men saw the flower and thought spring must be coming to catch them. So they gathered up their ice and snow and hurried off to Jack Frost's kingdom in the North Pole. And spring had come. So every year yet, when everybody is tired of winter, the crocuses come up to the snow and Jack Frost is frightened away. Then spring comes quickly. The fairy party. I wish I could give a party sometime, said Leafbud, as she and White Violet were swinging on some tall grasses over by the brook. We go to the Queen's parties all the time, and I think we ought to have one ourselves. Do you think we could really have a party and invite the Queen? Exclaimed White Violet, her eyes big and wide as she wondered at the idea. Of course we could, said Leafbud confidently. Only we'd have to work hard and have everything very nice if we intend to invite the Queen. We might ask Sparkling Shell to help us. All right, said White Violet. Let's go to her now. So down the ground they jumped and ran off to find Sparkling Shell. After a long hunt, they found her playing with her paints down by the pool. But when she found there was going to be a party, she happily stopped and promised to help. Where in the world shall we have it? Asked White Violet, puckering the front of her forehead while the others looked straight ahead and thought very hard. Oh, I know, shouted Sparkling Shell, dancing up and down until the shell on her brow sparkled like a diamond. Let's have it at the 3 big water lily leaves out on the pond. The others looked where she pointed, and sure enough, there were 3 beautiful green water lily leaves, plenty big enough for a party, and just beside them were 2 lovely big lilies, white with golden centers, and beyond were several different kinds of white lilies standing straight and tall above the water. Just the very place, they all shouted, for we can play on 2 of the leaves and have our good things to eat on another. Now let's plan what to do. So they sat down on the bank and got their heads very close together and whispered their plans for the party. Green, green, sorry, Green Twig and Silvermoss saw them together and suspected they were planning some fun and said, "Come on, girls, come and play with us for a while." "Not today," said Sparkling Shell proudly. "We are too busy planning a zissa. Hooray, hello," shouted Leafbud as she jumped up and put her hand over Sparkling Shell's mouth just in time to keep the word party from coming out. "You must be careful not to tell," she whispered, "and call to the boys in their most grown-up manner. We're entirely too busy to play today. You will have to excuse us." "All right," said the boys. "We don't care so much." And they started off by themselves. But they had gone only a little way when Silver Moss said, "Let's sit down here and watch what they're doing and see if it's really so much fun." So they sat down on some nice soft moss and watched very carefully. Pretty soon they saw Leafbud go away, and she hunted up the sleepy old king of the spiders and had a long talk with him. White Violet went to the palace of the king of the lightning bugs and had a long conference with him, and Sparkling Shell went to the daisy field and picked a great armful of daisies and brought them back by the pond. "Now, can you make anything of that?" asked Green Twig disgustedly as he saw White Violet and Leafbud return to the bank of the brook. "No, I can't," replied Silver Moss, and they watched carefully a little longer, but the three fairies were only painting daisies, so they gave up trying to find out the secret and started to play other games. About noon, every fairy in the forest was surprised to find at his home a daisy delivered there by a fairy messenger. On every one of the white daisy petals was a word, and on every one of the white daisy petals was a word. And if they began at the right place and read straight around, they found the message, "Come to a party on the pond at sundown." Well, you may be sure that there was much clapping of hands and dancing for joy all through the forest as the messages were read, for everybody loves to go to a party. Everybody wondered who was giving the party and how it could be on the pond. But each fairy was so busy fixing his best clothes and getting ready to go that there was really no time to find out. All afternoon, the three hostess fairies, with the help of 100 spiders and 1,000 fireflies, worked and worked until at last everything was ready. They barely had time to slip home and change their dresses and shoes before sundown. When the western sky grew pink and the big red sun was just ready to cover his head for the night, the queen and all her subjects arrived for the party. And such a beautiful scene they saw before them. From the shore to the big lily leaves were stretched ropes of flowers held together by silver strands, making a wide wall. All the tall lilies had been painted blue or pink, and the family of fireflies was shut up in each lily so that when they glowed like the huge blue and pink lanterns hung from the clouds. From lily to lily, the busy spiders had woven silken strands of thousands of fireflies marched up and down, over and along the silver ropes until the whole pond seemed like a blaze of light and color. The queen and her subjects stood on the bank, watching the beautiful scene before them. When the twilight faded to night and the stars peeped out overhead to see what made all the beautiful light on the color earth, the queen stepped daintily out on the flower walk. Everybody followed her out to the big lily leaf, and the party began. Such dances as they danced, and such games as they played, only the old man at the moon saw, and he never told a word about it. At midnight they had a lovely supper of honey and candied violets, and then the fun went on until the stars got tired of watching and went to sleep, and the old man and the moon dropped down behind a hill, and the eastern sky glowed pink. Then everybody told White, Violet, Budleaf, and Sparkling Shell what a lovely party it had been, and said goodbye and went sleepily home very happily. But was that all that was left from the party? No, indeed. For do you know, ever since, the tall water lilies have been pink and deep blue, and the daisies, and every daisy field you will find some daisies with odd markings on their white petals. Grown folks would tell you that they are variants, but you know better. They're really marks left from the fairy letters, and from when we read about the fairy party. Forget-me-nots. For 3 long days the rain had fallen, rain and more rain, until the fairies and the whole of the forest thought the sun must be lost, so it couldn't shine any more. It really seems as if each night all the water that came down was rain during the day must be drawn up into clouds again, only to come down as more rain the next day. That seemed really the only way, for the fairies didn't believe the clouds could hold all at once as much water as fell in 3 days. At last the rain stopped, but still the sun forgot to shine, and everything in the forest seemed gray and wet and sloppy. I'm so glad to see you, Lucy. Oh dear, sighed Green Twig. We'll visit at the end if you want to stick around. Oh dear, sighed Green Twig, peeping out of the flower where he had been hiding during the rain. It is so dismal and wet looking, but I can't stay here any longer. I must stretch. So down he jumped into the soft, spongy mud beneath the flower, and off he went to find a playmate. First, he whistled under Leafbud's flower, then under Silvermoss's, but no answer. So he went on until he came to where White Violet lived, and there he didn't try whistling. He simply shook the flower stem so hard that White Violet thought there must be a dreadful windstorm, and peeked out between the petals to see what could be the matter. It stopped raining, said Green Twig. Come down and play. All right, said White Violet, daintily flying down to the ground. But what can we play when everything is so wet? Oh, we can find something to do, said Green Twig happily. But first let's make others come with us. He and White Violet ran from the flower, laughing and shaking the stems until all their fairy playmates were tumbling to the ground. Now that you have us all down in the mud, what shall we do? Asked Leafbud crossly. You see, he had just been dreaming of a beautiful sailing in the sunny cloud, and he didn't like being woken up tumbled into the mud. Oh, I don't know what to do, said Green Twig, for now the fun of waking everybody up was over. He couldn't think of anything else to do. Well, said Silver Moss dismayedly. You know we can't always ask the queen. Yes, they all shouted, brightening up with that cheerful idea. Let's go see the queen, for she always knows something to do. They all started towards the palace, but they had a sorry time getting there, for the mud splashed with every step, and big drops of water dripped from the trees. The fairy wings got limp and damp, and the pearly shoes all splashed till finally they took turns, and somebody said, Mucus Cleanius, all the time in the way they got to the palace fairly tidy. The queen must have seen them coming, for she leaned out of her flower and called, How do you do, everybody? I am so very glad to see you. I wasn't expecting any visitors today. Come on, come in, right into my palace. She jumped down and led the way to a lovely dry spot under some big May apple leaves, which were just like umbrellas, and there they all played until a lot of the water had been soaked into the ground and everything was much drier. But still the sun didn't shine, and the sky was gray as it could be. Oh dear, sighed Sparkle Shell. I am so tired of romping here. I want the sun to shine and the sky to smile. Of course, we all want that, said the Queen very gravely. I think I would rather see blue sky than anything I know of. But with all of my magic, I cannot change the sky. I'll tell you what we can do, though, she added. Her face brightened into a smile. Each of you get your paint boxes, and I'll tell you a splendid thing to do. Everyone was off with a skip and a jump, and it wasn't more than 2 minutes before every fairy was back again with paint boxes in hand. Now, said the Queen, what do you most want to see? Answer carefully. Everybody looked around, up and down, and they saw the gray sky and the gray earth and even a gray, muddy brook tumbling over gray rocks. Almost with one voice they shouted, We want to see the blue sky. Just as I thought, said the little Queen. Now, look at this flower. She held up a white flower with 4 tiny white petals. Do you see any of these growing around? She asked. Yes, indeed, cried White Violet. There are lots of them along the edge of the brook. That is true, replied the Queen. Now I want you to paint these flowers the color of the sky. The fairies set to work very happily. They were selecting the flowers, getting their brushes, and mixing their paints when Green Twig exclaimed, Oh dear, I can't remember the color of the sky. It's many colors of blue. That made the fairies stop and think, and nobody could remember the exact color of blue the sky had been. That is a problem. The Queen saw the trouble they were in and held up her hand for them to stop work and listen. All this spring, she said, I've been watching the sky and looking at it morning, night, and noonday. Some of its blue is stored in my eyes. So they looked into her eyes and saw love and kindness and the blue of the sunny heavens. And every fairy began painting at once, and in a short time all the tiny flowers that had been white were as blue as the Queen's shining eyes, and the ground looked as if a tiny piece of the sky had dropped down from heaven, Just then the clouds parted, and from a blue sky the sun looked out on all the fairies busily painting. At last every little flower was painted and the brushes all cleaned and put away. Every fairy was happy to see such beautiful work well done. I wish this flower had a name, said White Violet, softly touching the velvety blue petals. Maybe it has. I'll ask the queen. No, said the queen when she was asked, but the flower is too little to have a name. But every time you look at it, please think of sunshine and blue skies and forget me not. And ever since that day, the tiny blue flower, the color of sky, had been called Forget Me Nots. Yes, indeed. My friends, we came to the end of yet another book.